Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
You're watching Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Tonight, we thought we'd take the opportunity for us to reconsider what we know about the larger multicultural context of Hari Raya and take the opportunity to reflect about what it means, not just here in Peninsula, but also across the South China Sea in the territories of Sabah and Sarawak. Joining us in this conversation tonight, we have Nathaniel Tan and Dr. Siti Nur Munirah Ibrahim from Project Wawasan Rakyat. I'm delighted to have you both on the show. Welcome, guys. Hope you're having a good Hari Raya, a bit, I'm sure, one that's a lot quieter than the Rayas past. How has the Aidilfitri celebrations been, both of you?
Great, thank you. Selamat Hari Raya, everybody.
Munirah, has it been a quiet Raya so far?
SOP compliant.
SOP compliant. All right, let's talk a little bit about the kind of interfaith conversations that are happening in Malaysia. I know there are many interfaith organizations try to bring those types of conversations to the fore, make that inclusive to all parts of society, of Malaysian society. But I'm just wondering how representative those conversations are and whether they really reflect the conversations that are happening in wider Malaysia, the concerns between ordinary Malaysians, and how effective those interfaith dialogues are in truly fostering a sense of understanding and acceptance. Maybe I can begin with you, Dr. Munirah. What do you think?
Thank you, Melisa. Assalamualaikum, everyone. I think effectiveness per se is probably a little difficult to assess unless, we're talking academically without actually going into studies about them. But in terms of the representation, I think what we observe is that when topics come up that are particularly sensitive to interfaith and interracial issues, there does tend to be discussions, among different groups. And I think this is great. I think it's definitely progress that we are talking to each other about these issues that we differ opinions about. However, I think also the concerns that raise when we do have these dialogues are the same dialogues reaching the ground level or the top level where these issues actually raise from. Most of the time, the discussions happen between people who are already open to differing opinions and can accept each other's opinions. But, at the ground level where there tends to be suspicion of one another or misperception of each other, we're worried that these discussions don't reach those levels. And at the top levels where people have different agendas, again, if the discussions aren't happening there, then we're sort of maybe still stuck where we are. So yeah, effectiveness is probably a little bit difficult to assess in that aspect.
Right. Nat, what do you think? Just in terms of the conversations that are happening, are they reflective? Are these interfaith dialogues reflective of conversations that are happening in wider Malaysia?
Thanks very much, Melissa. I think Dr. Munirah made a lot of astute points. I don't think they reflect the conversations on the ground so much as they reflect what a better version of those conversations can be. I think we should be honest about the kind of things that we all read in our various WhatsApp groups. There's a lot of content that really isn't all that friendly about people of other religions. From a non-Muslim background, I can tell you that Islamophobia and an allergy towards anything Islamic are sentiments that are alive and well, rampant almost, And I think this stems from a lot of mistrust and the fact that we've been pitted against each other by politicians for decades. So these interfaith organizations and dialogues, they're a great way to move away from the culture of division towards a culture of mutual respect and understanding. They represent a shift from talking at one another to talking to one another in an effort to heal Malaysia's many wounds, as well as identify and build upon common ground. In many ways, these initiatives embody what some of us think of as the essence of Bangsa Malaysia. There is more that unites us than divides us.
Yeah, I'd like to ask the both of you about this. It's in some ways it's this theory that the political elite have in this country that without them, without their role in mediating conflicts on the ground, the country would spin out of control. Because the counter to that is that they are in fact the source of much of the conflict, and that people on the ground are actually, by and large, quite happy to live with each other. There might be differences, and I want to bring up this idea of the neighborhood. We see it in popular culture. Neighborhoods are the microcosm of Malaysian society. And yes, there might be tensions, but there's also dialogue and negotiation across fences. And when it comes to something like festivities, different cultural and religious festivities, there's a sharing, right? A welcoming of others into your home, a sharing of food, and so on and so forth. What is the Malaysian neighborhood like today, Munirah?
Thanks, Sharaad. Well, I think 2020 and 2021 have just been, we've been in pandemic mode. So does neighborhood even exist to a certain extent? I think we've been very much affected by that. We've all been living pretty much in isolation, SOP compliant as much as we can, and, keeping to each other because of the pandemic. So I think we've definitely been affected by that majorly. If we go back, a few generations to our parents' generations, where I think people were much more comfortable with each other. We knew people of different races, of different religions, and I think social media has also played a big part in this as well, because social media can be great if it's spreading positivity, but it can be damaging if it's spreading negative ideas. And when you're in isolation and not mixing with each other, that can sometimes be the only the only source of information that you get. And unfortunately, there are groups that are using social media to spread these negative ideas. So I think somewhat we're all being more isolated due to the pandemic.
Right. Nat, do you also share the same view? I love the idea of going back to the neighborhood to really truly build our kind of interfaith. That is the root of all interfaith dialogue, right? We're our neighbors. But again, Munirah's right, the pandemic, but not just the pandemic, but also lifestyle and urbanization. And you're absolutely right. Years and decades of politicians and politics pitting us against one another. Has that idea of the neighborhood as the bedrock of a racial unity, has that disintegrated or been eroded to the point of no return?
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, I think what you guys have described as the neighborhood, this kind of muhibah feeling that used to be there. I like to think of that as the natural state of Malaysia. That's how it would be if you just leave Malaysians to their own devices and you let them just live their own lives without interference. What we get is a corruption of that natural state. I know it's bad during Raya to speak bad of people, but yeah, I think our political system and the politicians that inhabit it have a lot to do with that. I think the incentive structure of our political structures have made it such that politicians are incentivized to divide people, to memecah belahkan rakyat, to melaga-lagakan rakyat for political gain. So I think it's really tragic. People, our parents' generation, they always talk about the golden years of how everyone, embrace these kind of differences, visit one another in times like this, and really have real bonds. And again, like I said, I think this, if without intervention, without the kind of negative intervention that we're getting, you'd see a return to this natural state.
I wanted to provide a counter to that, which is that in the natural state, I mean, it's not that everybody's kind of kumbaya and, loving each other, but that there is an ability to negotiate with real people, right? And people that that you cannot separate yourself from. That's the nature of the neighbor. The neighbor doesn't go away, right? Whereas on social media, you can live in your own world with people who agree with you. And what, the question really is, I think today, is whether we are able to have those difficult conversations too. Neighbors have difficult conversations. If you live in a condo, for instance, the residence committees, management committees are the most horrific cauldrons of conflict and selfishness. So we know how things actually work. How do we build a vocabulary to deal with those differences and those difficulties? That's my question. In the setting of those kind of natural communities, as you put it, Nat. Munirah, maybe first.
Okay, so I think the biggest barrier that we have to unity is basically fear, and this fear can be, pure, very much unbased, meaning that it's when you don't know one another, that's when you fear one another. And I think the more engagement we have with each other, we understand each other more. We realize that we're all the same. We're all human beings with the same basic needs and requirements. We may have differences, but we can agree to disagree on those differences. And we focus on what we all want in common. And when you talk about neighborhood, what do we want in a neighborhood? We want safety. We want to be able to go out, for our children to go out without being scared of being abducted or being harmed. We want to be able to be COVID-free together. We want to be able to go out and work, to be safe, to be happy, to be well. And those are, the needs of any human being. So once we start realizing that despite, my neighbor's faith or, this neighbor's culture or religion, we all want the same thing, and all religions teach the same thing. So once we realize that and realize there's actually nothing to fear from each other, then I think that's where we start to make the bridges.
Right. Nat, before I go to you to get your answer on that question, we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to say thank you so much to Dr. Munirah for joining us on the show tonight. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your insights on this and lending your voice to the conversation. Selamat Hari Raya to you. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll come back and continue this conversation about interfaith after this. Stay tuned to consider this. Hi, thanks for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. We are reflecting tonight about the true meaning of interfaith relations or inter-religious relations, and reflecting a little bit, taking the time out during Hari Raya to reflect about what these conversations mean to us and whether they resonate with wider Malaysia. We welcome back Nathaniel Tan from earlier in the conversation. He's a coordinator with Project Wawasan Rakyat, or better known as Power. And also now joining us on the line is Muhammad Faisal Aziz, President of Angkatan Belia Islam Malaysia, or better known as ABIM. Faisal, Selamat Hari Raya to you. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. Before we get to you, Faisal, I'd just like to come back to let Nathaniel finish his thought from earlier in the conversation. We asked about what it really means to engage people who hold different views from us, particularly at a neighborhood level. We acknowledge that other people hold different views. Nat, you talked a little bit earlier about, acknowledging that sometimes on WhatsApp you get uncomfortable messages about other races, other religions. Let's talk about how to engage people who hold different views. What would you say to them? Where do you start?
I mean, I think what happens a lot is that a large part of what I call the narrative center of gravity tends to bend towards extremists, and the people who are stoking interreligious tensions for their own gain. And a lot of the time, this whole situation paints a picture of when it comes to Muslim and non-Muslim relations, it paints a picture of Islam that is very different from what I've come to observe and experience. People tend to see Islam as expressed by politicians or extremists. So when they see Islamic NGOs like Ikram or ABIM, they tend to lump them in the same category. But to me, however, there is really a night and day difference. I've seen the good work on the ground that these NGOs do. I've sat and shared many cups of Milo with their leaders, and to be clear as I can about what I've concluded, they are not out to get you, no more than you are out to get them. Then that's one of the, so you talk about key messages, that's the kind of thing that I try and convey. I've seen how these groups provide aid during the MCO to groups and communities whose lifestyles they may not necessarily agree with, but I've seen how humbly they live in vast contrast to the lavish lifestyles of our politicians and so on, and I've seen them consistently uphold values of justice, fairness, and compassion. So it really boils down to this whole idea of tak kenal maka tak cinta. If you really go on the ground, and Sharaad was talking about dialogue and and really bridging that gap, and I think it really comes down to human interactions. If you take the time to interact, and it's very different from fighting with people on Facebook or Twitter. You take the time to talk to them over a cup of coffee. It's a really different experience.
Well, Faisal, if I can ask you to kind of reflect on, how Malaysia is changing. I come from a family that's actually multi-religious. My father's partner of 30 years was Muslim. I myself am an atheist. My brother's a Christian. The person who brought me up as a young boy was a Muslim herself. And so we've all had, some of us have been lucky to have this family-based interreligious experience. Not everybody has that opportunity. I don't think it necessarily leads to great things. So I want to ask you if, we assume that more interaction leads to understanding and harmony. But is that true? Are we also different in some fundamental ways? And if we're truly going to understand each other, don't we have to accept those differences that are perhaps not going to go away just because we wish them to go away?
Yes, actually, of course, if you talk about multi-religious ethnic, multi-religious group in Malaysia, of course, there are many fundamental things that, of course, cannot be compromised. But at least by having the interfaith activism or interfaith initiative, we can build some bridges to find common ground. And of course, when we talk about the common ground that we want to have, for me, if I may share, the main issue is consistency. Whatever religions that you are, have, or whatever views that you are subscribing, you have to be consistent in your stand. So when you talk about the finding solution, for example, when you talk about finding common ground, you have to be consistent in the first place. You have to evaluate the concerns from the rest and evaluating it in the consistent stance. So, for example, if one spread the hate speech against or slamming other religion, so all of us have to come together to criticize the action or the hate speech, regardless of whatever religions of the person are. And of course, like for example, the issue of Palestinian, now we are having the issue of Palestinian being oppressed in Jerusalem. So when you talk about injustice, when you fight against injustice by Israel towards Palestinian, towards your own community, you have to carry the same cause to fight against injustice towards other races as well. So consistency matters in bringing in bringing the racial harmony in Malaysia.
Can I ask you, Faisal, just a follow-up question on that? Racial harmony in Malaysia, is that what you would consider to be, the end goal, the positive outcome when it comes to interfaith initiatives? I'm just wondering because, earlier in the conversation, we asked Dr. Munirah what she considers to be, whether interfaith dialogues are actually effective in Malaysia. And I'm wondering where you stand on that. How would you gauge the effectiveness of interfaith initiatives? What would you consider to be a positive outcome of that?
Yeah, actually, interfaith engagement, at least it have something contribution. For the community, diversifying perspectives. For example, the way of thinking. Instead of being complacent with one homogeneous group, I think in the WhatsApp group, one homogeneous, one religion or one races, and also whenever there is an issue played by irresponsible or some quarters. So this kind of interfaith initiatives will initiate some initiative to diffuse tensions. If I may share, the most current issue of the most Reverend Archbishop Julian Leo, when he was slammed by some quarters, when some quarters tried to manipulate his speech in 2014, as if he wished to boil Muslim. So ABIM, together with Project Raya, we took initiative to meet him personally and to get genuine explanation from him. So this kind of reaction or initiative only can be done when you interact with each other, when you try to get a more solution-driven approach in terms of dialogue.
Okay, Faisal, if I could sort of interrupt you there, just I just want to bring us back to Hari Raya, and you mentioned boiling, and it reminds me of food, and I know food is very important in the way even traditionally, we've thought about dialogue in this country. Itun Sambadan's durian, post May 13th durian eating parties, I think is very famous for the idea of making food central to building community. And I want to ask Nat, where do you think that's gone? We all have food restrictions. Vegetarians don't eat meat. Muslims and Jews don't eat pork. Christians, ex-Christians like myself, eat everything as long as we're offered it. How do we build on a very basic level the trust to eat with each other again? And I think that's something that in some parts of the country have become very, very shaky. Nat?
Yeah, I think you spoke earlier as well, Sharaad, about this kumbaya thing, and it's true. Sometimes the way we talk, we use a lot of nice words and things like that, and I think you do a good job of pressing people to really ask what they mean, and of course we're not talking about homogenization, we're not talking about making everyone the same. We're not expecting that to make all conflict go away and things like that, But I think, the thing you're talking about food and all that, I think is related to this question of like sensitivities, and then again, how Malaysian society is growing apart. So the work that we do, and Faisal and Abim have played a absolutely pivotal role in this, is to try and reverse that trend, to stop being so afraid of one another, and stop focusing on our differences and start to find what our commonalities are, what are the things we have in common, the common ground. Yeah, it can start from things as simple as nasi lemak and all that, but obviously there are a lot of things that go deeper. I think Malaysians inherently have a deep sense of compassion, a deep sense of like helping one another, kita jaga kita, this kind of thing, the values about integrity and things like that. I think normal everyday on the ground Malaysians, these are common values that we share, and I think all we are missing is that we are flooded by the narrative of division. What we need is a different narrative, a stronger narrative, and somebody needs to build that thing and put it together. So again, Abim done a great work on this. They had an interfaith dialogue with the Dalai Lama. They have an interfaith climate change network. All these kind of things. These are excellent steps. Again, building on what is it that is common to all of us. Caring about the environment and things like that. So I think these are the important steps in building back that kind of atmosphere that you were talking about.
All right. I just want to jump in very quickly, Sharaad. I love that phrase. How can we learn to trust to eat with each other again? I love that. I wanted to ask Faisal, in the few minutes that we have left, Faisal, what does that phrase mean to you? And what kind of narratives would you like to build? If I may just echo what Nat said, what kind of narratives would you like to build and leave us with tonight as we reconsider what interfaith relationships mean?
Okay. Okay, to answer that question, I think I do believe that Malaysian society, we are subscribing the idea of moderation. The vast majority of us will not want to be, on the side of extreme, either conservative or the opposite. But now having the current, the issues of economic turmoil or economic instability, not only in Malaysia but also across the globe. There are certain quarters or some quarters playing the fan the hatred against other races. For example, they tend to put the blame on other races because of their failure. So this reflects that the moderations, the concept that defines Malaysians losing its own ground. So we need to revert back Malaysian, to bring the whole Malaysian to be back on the right track, to be subscribing the idea of moderation. Because as I said now, because of the moderation itself, because as I said, when I do believe that Malaysians are subscribing the idea of moderation, so meaning to say it facilitates the idea of interfaith dialogue or interfaith or any harmonious activism that we should create for the sake of national harmony. And of course, Abim, if I may share a bit, we have been consistently building on the heritage of cosmopolitan Islam. And that's the basic things or the basic theme that we want to carry forward. The character of universal, emollient, moderate, just and so on. All of it are encapsulated under the concept of cosmopolitan Islam. It is our own heritage, Islam in Southeast Asia, is full of color of cosmopolitan that we should bring forward for the future of Malaysia.
Cosmopolitan Islam. Thank you, Faisal, for joining us on the show tonight. We wish you good evening and Selamat Hari Raya. And Nathaniel, thank you also for being on the show. Appreciate your time. That's all we have for you in this episode of Consider This. But as always, before we leave you, I'd like to remind you that you can get all the latest news and information on COVID-19 vaccines at astroawani.com and the Astro AWANI app. Thank you so much for watching the show tonight. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
We will be back with you same time on Monday. Till then, have a great weekend and Selamat Hari Raya.